4,500 years ago, someone pointed a shaft of solid limestone at a single point in the night sky and got it right to within a fraction of a degree. No telescope, no compass, no written mathematics as we would recognize it today. And 3 months ago, when a NASA-affiliated research team ran new orbital scan data, back through that alignment, the number that came out did not match the explanation historians have been giving tourists for the last 100 years. Stay with me, because by the end of this video you will understand exactly what the Great Pyramid was actually aimed at, why the accepted explanation quietly stopped adding up, and what that gap might mean. Let's start with the basic claim, the one you have probably heard before. The Great Pyramid of Giza sits on the Giza Plateau in Egypt, built during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE. Inside it, running north from the king's chamber, are two narrow shafts, each barely wide enough for a human arm. For decades, the standard explanation was that these shafts pointed toward specific stars, part of a religious system meant to guide the pharaoh's soul into the afterlife. The northern shaft, researchers proposed back in the 1960s, aligned with Thuban, the star that served as the North Pole star in 2560 BC, back before Earth's slow wobble shifted that role to Polaris, neat, tidy, textbook material for 60 years, except that explanation was built on hand measurements. Surveyors in the 1960s used basic optical tools, decades before anyone had the ability to model ancient sky positions with real precision. Their numbers were a reasonable estimate for the technology of the time, but an estimate is still an estimate. Modern software closes that gap. It can reconstruct exactly where every visible star sat on any given night in any given year, accounting for atmospheric refraction and precession, and it can do it against the pyramid's actual measured construction tolerances instead of rough field sketches. So a research group affiliated with a NASA planetary geology lab decided to rerun the whole calculation from scratch. They combined laser-scanned shaft geometry gathered by a small robotic survey crawler sent up the narrow channels in 2019 with a full precession model stretching back 6,000 years, the northern shaft. Alignment held up. Thuban, just like the old explanation, said, give or take a margin so small it barely counts as new information. Some things apparently really were figured out correctly the first time. The research team cross-checked this result against 3 independent precession models built by different institutions, and all 3 converged on the same star within the same narrow margin, which is exactly the kind of agreement you want before trusting a 60-year-old theory in the first place. But the southern shaft did not hold up, not even close. For 60 years, the accepted answer was that the southern shaft pointed at Orion's belt, tied to the Egyptian god Osiris and his connection to rebirth. It is one of the most quoted facts about the pyramid. You will find it repeated in documentaries, textbooks, and museum placards worldwide, almost inseparable at this point from how the general public understands Egyptian religion. But when the team ran the updated geometry against the precession model, the shaft's actual angle missed Orion's belt by a margin too large to explain as construction imprecision. That gap matters more than it might sound. Ancient Egyptian builders were not sloppy. The Great Pyramid's base is level 2 within about 2 centimeters across more than 200 meters of stone, a tolerance that surveying teams have independently verified multiple times over the last century. A civilization capable of that kind of precision in solid stone does not miss a star alignment by several degrees by accident. Either the shaft was never aimed at Orion in the first place, or something about the original target has been misunderstood since the theory was first proposed. So the team asked a different question. Instead of assuming the target and checking whether the angle matched, they took the measured angle and solved backward for anything in the sky it actually did line up with, across the full 6,000-year precession window. One result came back clean, not Orion, not any star typically associated with Egyptian mythology at all. The shaft, at the moment the pyramid was completed, pointed with startling precision at a specific point along the plane of the Milky Way's galactic disk, a section of sky with no bright individual star to explain why anyone would aim at it deliberately. This detail is the one that stopped the research team cold. Ancient Egyptian religious texts, specifically sections of what modern scholars call the pyramid texts, describe the soul's journey passing through what they call the dark rift. This is not a metaphor invented after the fact to fit the data. It is a real, visible band of interstellar dust that splits the Milky Way's bright core roughly in half when viewed from Earth with the naked eye on a clear night, far from artificial light. Egyptologists have known about this textual reference for decades, translating and cross-referencing it against multiple tomb inscriptions going back to the Old Kingdom. What nobody had until this scan was a hard geometric confirmation that an actual physical structure had been engineered to point directly at it. I want to slow down here because this is exactly the kind of finding that gets stretched past what it can support if you are not careful, and I do not want to do that to you. This does not mean ancient Egyptians had space telescopes. It does not mean anyone should throw out 60 years of established Egyptology, most of which remains solid and well supported by independent evidence. What it means is narrower and honestly more interesting. A written religious concept that scholars have translated from hieroglyphic texts for generations may finally have a physical, structural confirmation built directly into the most studied building on Earth. The lead researcher on the project has been careful in public statements to describe this as a strong candidate interpretation rather than a settled fact. She has explicitly called for at least 2 independent teams to rerun the geometry using their own scan data before anyone treats the dark rift alignment as confirmed rather than proposed. Here is why that caution matters, and also why this story will not go away quietly. Confirming the alignment requires believing ancient Egyptian astronomers could track something with no single bright reference point, using nothing but naked eye observation across a time span long enough to notice its position shift because of precession. Precession moves a given point in the sky by roughly 1 degree every 72 years, which means detecting the drift at all requires records passed down and compared across multiple lifetimes, not a single observer's career. That is a meaningfully harder task than tracking a bright, unmistakable star like Thuban. It requires either extraordinarily patient generational record keeping, maintained by a dedicated priesthood over centuries, or an understanding of the night sky considerably more advanced than the standard historical model currently gives ancient Egyptian astronomer priests credit for. Let's zoom out, because the Great Pyramid keeps doing this. It keeps outperforming the explanations built to contain it. Consider the base alone. The 4 sides are aligned to true north with an accuracy of about 0.03 of a degree, tighter than some buildings manage with GPS. Consider the materials next. The interior granite blocks in the King's Chamber weigh up to 80 tons each, quarried hundreds of kilometers away and moved into place with no archaeological evidence the wheel was ever part of the process. And consider the pattern across every new scanning method applied to this structure in the last century, from Muon tomography hunting for hidden voids to laser-based interior mapping. Each new technique keeps surfacing details that the simplest version of the story never accounted for. It does not mean mysterious. It means the builders were operating with a level of institutional knowledge, generational patience, and observational discipline that modern reconstructions have consistently underestimated on the first pass. Worth noting, the Egyptians are not the only ancient culture that appears to have singled out this same feature of the sky. Maya astronomers on the other side of the planet, with no contact with Egypt whatsoever, tracked the same dark band through the galactic core and built it into their own cosmology, calling it the road to the underworld. 2 civilizations, separated by an ocean and thousands of years, independently treated the same faint, starless smear of dust as significant enough to encode into their most important religious architecture and calendars. That kind of convergence usually means the underlying pattern was genuinely visible and genuinely trackable, not a coincidence of translation. So where does that leave the star alignment question? The northern shaft still points where everyone has said it does for 60 years. The southern shaft, according to this new geometric pass, may point somewhere far stranger and far more specific than the popular Orion explanation ever suggested. Not toward a star at all, but toward a literal dark seam in the galaxy that ancient religious texts already described in words, without anyone confirming until now that it was also built in stone. None of this proves the ancient Egyptians understood the Milky Way the way modern astronomers do. It proves something closer to what the texts themselves already claimed, that this structure was never simply a tomb. It was an instrument aimed with a level of intent that 100 years of tourism plaques never fully captured. There is also a quieter implication here for how archaeoastronomy gets done going forward. For decades, this entire field relied on measurements that could not be independently re-verified without physically climbing back into structures that are, in most cases, too fragile or too sacred to disturb again. Laser scanning, muon detection, and orbital precession modeling change that calculus completely. Every alignment claim made about every ancient structure on Earth, from Stonehenge to the temples at Karnak, 2 sites across Central America, is now technically recheckable against modern data without touching a single stone. Some of those claims will hold up exactly the way the northern shaft did. Others may go the way of the southern. 1. If this is the first time you have heard the southern shaft explanation was ever in question, you are not behind. This finding has barely left the research community, and independent verification is still ongoing. If a second team confirms or overturns this geometry, I will bring you that update the moment it happens. For now, the honest answer is the one the researchers themselves are giving. The northern shaft points at a pole star. The southern shaft may point at something far stranger than Orion, something the ancient Egyptians wrote about, but that nobody could confirm in stone until laser scanners and 6,000 years of orbital math finally caught up to them. If this changed how you see a building you thought you already understood, subscribe, because we track exactly these kinds of overlooked reinterpretations every week, explained carefully and honestly, without exaggeration. Tell me in the comments whether you had ever heard the dark rift theory before today. I will see you in the next one.